Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
So we've talked a lot about the torso and the need to lengthen and widen the torso or expand the torso. But so far you haven't mentioned whether we can or should or how we would engage in complex rotational movements of the torso, and how does this relate to lengthening and widening the torso?
Yes, I've seen we had a question from a listener. And so you have to understand that at first, this is about learning a new conscious use of the mind in order to create coordination patterns that are advantageous for breathing, advantageous for the functioning of the organism. So it's not the point when we start teaching to engage into great complex rotational movement of the upper torso relative to the lower torso, for the simple reason that, of course, these movements are possible, but this movement entails systematically a shortening of the torso. So we do not ask people to stop practicing these kinds of movements, not at all. But it's more important to us to teach them how to organize the torso. Alexander used the term readjust the mechanism of the torso after practicing their posture or their movements that are necessary for the activity that they have in mind, using ordinary activities, day-to-day activity like sitting, standing, walking, where the idea is to minimize the number of counter rotation of the upper and lower torso. Of course, this is not to say that we are against rotational movements, but it's more important to people that are doing these rotational movements to understand how they can experiment by themselves and discover how they can sort their own complex coordinated movements when they are doing this. What we are teaching is not the correct way. What we are teaching is a way of experimenting. And so once the person understands how to name the movements, it will be possible for her to look at herself while she's doing these movements on a video recording. And well, if it's necessary, adjust in consequence. What is most important is that after practicing the activity, she has everything she needs in order to readjust the mechanism of the torso to recreate the best organization of the movements in, well, the normal standing or sitting gesture that are habitual.
And so someone can use the same principles and technique and apply it to whatever it is they do, whether it's dancing or some kind of sport.
Yeah, there is an example that is given by Alexander. It's the golf swing. It's very obvious that in the golf swing, the large golf swing, the rotational speed of the upper part of the torso and the arms is not the same as the rotational speed of the pelvis. Therefore, there is a use of elasticity in the torso, and obviously you can't do a swing without doing these rotational movements. And so there are many now professional sportsmen that use the same motion analysis as we do in order to observe these movements, see what are their habits, what it is they don't feel when they do these movements. And so the same principles of experimental discovery will apply when you do a complex gesture. The point of the lessons is not to study a particular activity like golf, or I don't know, in certain poses of yoga. Also, you have to engage series of movements that will lead to serious shortening, serious rotational movements. I do not teach how to improve these movements. I teach how the person can readjust the mechanism of the torso after doing the movement, coming back to, like, would you say, neutral, or coming back to balance? So that's the answer. The person is free to engage in any sort of activity, any sort of rotational movement, and we engage her to, first of all, learn how to get out of these movements and reconstruct a correct organization of the mechanism of the torso through different movements, through readjustments of the movements. And the principle that we teach, the principle of experiments, are going to be as useful to study any sort of gesture.
Excellent. And for anyone listening, I'm currently doing lessons in kickboxing. So this can be applied to any kind of vigorous activity that you want to get involved in. It's not about fixing yourself into a position and maintaining it. It's not like a mentality of set and forget your posture. It's about being able to experiment and improve it based on using the video and having the model of what Alexander's given us.
And that brings us to the theme I'm developing at the moment, is the use and consciousness of the reasoning controlling mind. Once you are able to, in fact, analyze a series of movements, it's possible to describe them. It's possible also to imagine a different series to replace the old one. So we are going to call these the new orders of movements. You can have new orders of movement in mind. And also, what our listeners should know is that in the initial Alexander technique, the readjustment, the time that beginners will work with, that is before you readjust, after the readjustment is done, is very, very quick. The use of the mind is fantastic for that. It's not like the sensory feeling. People that are on the somatic plane, they always want to slow down movements. Well, it's obvious that this is for feeling, as if feeling the different parts of the movement would help the person anticipate bad habits and change. We do not agree with that view. We think that feeling, slowing down to feel movements is absolutely unnecessary, and it's unwanted, because it means that instead of being guided by the mind, by the superior mind of reasoning and construction and planning, you're suddenly back to basic, back to being guided by feeling. So when we perform a readjustment of movements, it takes nothing more than a second or two, which means that it's always possible during any very active practice. It's always possible to have a conscious thought of a series of acts to be engaged very, very quickly. There are two things to separate. One is the time it takes to give the orders, and the other is the time it takes to transform these orders into intentions and decisions, and decisions that are compacted into one. I make a long series of orders. This may take time. I've always got some pupils that want to find a way to shorten the sentences of the orders of the new orders of movement. They think that it's too long. Well, this reminds me that, again, we are back into this old somatic habit of having in mind an order, and also having in mind how it would feel, what it would be to do that order. If you were to do that order, it would be an order in isolation. And if that order is done, if one movement is done in isolation, inside of gesture, Alexander points to the fact that all the other parts that are moving at the same time are going to be guided by the old system of sensory guidance, of somatic cognition. Embodied cognition is going to take over all the other movements. So if you have one movement that is conscious and 10 that are subconscious, well, you have no chance to ever being able to change the whole set of movements. So it's necessary to understand that the time it takes to give orders is not important. It's better to take all the time in the world to say the order, to give the orders, as that's how Alexander presented it, two different phases. One phase where you give orders, and the other phase where you perform one decision that is in fact a compact of all the decisions you have planned with the different orders. So in this case, it doesn't matter, because when you give your orders very slowly with all the time in the world, you're just memorizing them. So when it will be time to perform this decision, well, you will perform them by memory. It's never the time to rehearse the orders when you are performing the readjustment gesture. It would take ages. It's not possible. So make a big difference in your mind between the verbal orders that we give and that we memorize, all the decision that we want to be performed as once, as Alexander used the term altogether, you know? And so these are two different phases that are very important to understand. And so now I'm going to explain the free use of the reasoning controlling mind. Last time I started to explain that Alexander was defining his lessons in this way, and it was useful for me to, in fact, differentiate one initial Alexander technique where there is no hands-on, where there is no somatic learning or somatic imprinting or somatic like trials where you are made to feel the correct movement. Here we want really to, separate the modern Alexander technique, the somatic technique, from what we are doing. And so in this way, you will see what we mean by the use of the reasoning controlling mind. So in this, we started that all somatic techniques are to fail. That was last week interview, and that's where Alexander in Man Supreme Inheritance was introducing the idea of using the reasoning mind in the construction of a new coordination. So you have to start with the beginning. There is one pupil that is coming, and that pupil is going to be seen on screen. So the diagnostic that is going to be given is a diagnostic that is given only by a visual observation of the different movements the person is producing in order to do one act. We just ask the person to do one act, to, for example, reach forward with one hand. For the person, this is going to be considered as one act. The person has no idea that in order for the hand to move forward in space, there must be support, that the momentum of the hand forward, even in the sitting position, is going to introduce an equilibrium problem. That is, the momentum of the arm has to be compensated by momentum of the torso parts. The individual has no realization of this fact, and for him, he knows what you mean when you say, could you please bring the hand forward? And the person will do so, filmed by the camera. From that moment on, we are starting to get into this idea of using the reasoning controlling mind. That is, the teacher is going to communicate with the pupil so that the pupil will start to think about his gestures, simple gestures like moving the hand forward, in a slightly different way, or in a completely different way from the one he's used to. In the normal way, the person is going to use the mind and In fact, in the construction of the movement, the person will have the end in mind. It's, for example, reaching for something. If I say place the hand on the back of the chair, the person is going to use the mind and so construct the movement with a target and a trajectory. And the target and the trajectory most of the time will involve one element. The element, for example, in this case is the hand, because to reach for the top of the chair, the person is going to reach with the hand. So the trajectory the person has in mind is the trajectory of the hand. So at that moment, it's possible to introduce an idea, a disturbing idea, that what has happened, for example, to another part while the person was guiding the trajectory consciously. The trajectory of the hand is guided consciously. The person has represented in her mind what was the position, the starting position of the hand and the end position of the hand. So we could say that that movement is conscious. Yet, it's very simple to ask the question to the pupil and ask what has happened to, for example, the elbow. What has been the trajectory of the elbow? What has been the trajectory of the shoulder? You will find most of the time that the pupil has no idea. And the trajectory of the elbow has been guided, Alexander says, habitually. And he says habitually, for him, it's guided by the feeling sense. The person has no feeling that she's guiding the elbow in one way or another. What he means is that through repetition of the movement of reaching, the person has in fact constructed an habitual series of movements in which the elbow will have more or less the same trajectory every time the person reaches forward. It is interesting to use the reasoning mind at that moment and ask the question whether the person can imagine another trajectory for the elbow when the hand is moving forward. Of course, suddenly the possibility will occur. And the student or the pupil will start to, in fact, plan a new reaching movement with the hands that is different from the old one. So there is now the possibility to think of a new guiding order because the teacher has described with words the old trajectory of the elbow. The elbow is seen to move on screen inward systematically every time the elbow is moved inward and slightly upward. The reaching with the hand is associated with a movement of the shoulder, and the shoulder is seen to move upward. So the muscles of the neck that are linking the shoulder with the head are seen to be shortened every time. And we know that a short muscle is tight or tighter than a muscle that is lengthening. So apparently, the pupil must start with a decision to refuse to give consent to his ordinary doing. His ordinary doing is simply that it just gives the command to reach with the hand. It's very simple. Now there is a new command. There is a command to reach with the hand, but this command to reach with the hand will associate a movement of the elbow. And the pupil will see that when the movement of the hand and the movement of the elbow are consciously directed, then the shortening of the shoulder and neck is less than before. So the pupil starts to discover that it's possible for him or for her to, well, change the habitual way of producing the gesture. This is what Alexander is talking about. So let's have a look. I will show you, well, a sentence. So the reasoning should be, here are people whose physical development is unsatisfactory. And this is associated with their sensory misdirection of their habitual use of themselves. Surely, when they are given anything to do in the form of exercises, we should point out to them wherein this misdirection lies and give them the means of preventing it. My record shows that the farther I progressed in my search for a way to free myself from the slavery to habitual reaction in doing, which I had created for myself by trusting to the guidance of my unreliable sense of feeling, the more clearly I was forced to see that my only chance of freeing myself was, as a primary step, to refuse to give consent to my ordinary doing in carrying out any procedure. So let's go back to the previous case of the pupil reaching forward with the hand. Before I give any sort of exercise, it's absolutely necessary for the pupil to realize, to use the conscious reasoning mind to see that his habitual doing, in fact, involves a series of movements. Of course, reaching forward with the hand will involve not only the different movements of the part of the arm, but also it can be seen that the torso is affected by the habitual movement, because as soon as the shoulder are lifting, well, it can be absolutely certain that the torso is going to be misdirected. What we say misdirected activities, well, this is translated very simply by what sort of movement do we see? Do we see that the movement of reaching lead to a lengthening of the mechanism of the torso or to a shortening of the mechanism of the torso? Well, if there is a shortening of the mechanism of the torso, it doesn't matter if you change the trajectory of the hand. It makes no sense to try to improve, to try to feel better how to direct the hands. The problem is not in the hands. The problem is in the relationship between the movement of the mechanism of the arm and the movement of the mechanism of the torso. So there is a first step, of course, is to refuse to give consent to the ordinary doing. What does Alexander mean? Because there is a lot of misunderstanding about this, because this, of course, you understand relates to inhibition. For most people, inhibition is refusing to do. I refuse to do as a first step. Here, we discover that it's quite different from this. It's not refusing to do as a first step. It's to refuse to, in fact, reason movements as basic, as simple, as one order. And to, from there, from the fact that you've given yourself a conscious order to move one part, well, to stop and to trust to sensory feeling to guide the series of acts that are necessarily involved in the gesture. And that's where the use of the reasoning minds come in, because it's only by, in fact, being guided into observing the series of movements. I'm pointing the series of movement to the pupil most of the time. I'm using word to describe the series of movement. Suddenly for the person, it comes as normal to reason about a series of movement and says, well, there is nothing I can do that will not involve the series of movement. And the series of movement can only be described, understood, really planned by the reasoning mind. The feeling mind is not useful at all. You will, no matter how the movements are directed, you will feel something. And the something you're going to feel is going to change every single time you reproduce the same series, because the same series will never happen really. There are too many factors that are, in fact, acting on the series that you cannot reproduce the same series twice. You cannot get a feeling that describes a good series or a feeling that describe a bad series. For the simple reason that, well, certain movements have developed certain fascia, certain muscles, while others have been completely neglected. And when a fascia is trained, or when a muscle is trained, you understand that it develops in both directions. That is, the muscle will get quicker to reach, quicker to activate, yes. But at the same time, in the opposite direction too, when a muscle is not used, not trained, well, you will need to find some energy to add them into action. It will feel like strenuous for the simple reason that the muscle is not trained, moving with a trajectory that involves that muscle is going to be, well, more difficult and it will feel like strenuous and difficult. While when you look at the coordination of the movement on screen, well, it looks like nothing. Why is it that we feel such an effort when we are asked to perform a series in which there are new orders of movements? Well, it's simply because the physical part, in fact, is lagging behind. The connection between the physical and the mental is much more difficult to establish. As a result, there is a feeling associated with it. The only thing is that after a few days, just a few weeks of training in the conscious guidance of the series, that feeling is going to evaporate and the movement will feel like nothing. So at first, it often happens that a pupil will come to a lesson, nearly the 7th or 8th lesson, 9th or 10th lesson, and the pupil say, I'm not progressing anymore. Oh, how is that? Well, I can't get it anymore. At first, it was clear in my mind. Now, I can't get it. So I show the pupil a movement that was happening a few weeks earlier and the new movement. And I say, do you see that the new movement is much better organized now than before? And the pupil will realize, yes, but I can't understand it. Before, it was difficult, but I could really feel what was going on. Now I can't feel anything. Well, that's the fact that when you engage a coordination, after a while, it becomes usual, and there is no feeling associated with it. So you cannot guide that new coordination with the feeling you receive from it, because the feeling you receive from it is going to diminish every single day. So there must be something else, something conscious. And so we are back to this use where, in order to perform, you don't trust sensory feeling. You trust new orders of movement. Well, it's not because you give a new order of movement inside, of course, a series of acts that you're going to see the movement appear on screen by, some sort of a miracle. It's just because you say so, the movement is going to appear. No, at first it's not like this. In conscious guidance and control, there is a notion that we are in a process. You can at first represent one movement of the series, and you can discuss on a diagram what's going to be the center of rotation of that movement, where the movement should start, where it should end, what this movement should be like relative to a plane of reference, where other movement can be also observed, where a rule can be set so that when that movement is happening, you want to, of course, engage other movements so that you can see that these different movements occur at the same time. Fine. That is the mental part. But then there is a second aspect, is these orders, when you first try to project them in activity, so in performance, Well, in performance, you may see either no movement or the opposite of what you want, or you can see what you want, but with a very, very minute, small range of effect. You want to see a large movement and no on screen, even when you have the impression of giving it all, you know, of really making, straining. Very often when we do that, we confuse movements and force. There is this temptation to think that if I want more movement, I need more force. Well, very often it's the exact opposite. Movement and force have very little in common. If you want a movement, you have to train yourself to produce that movement when other movements are occurring. It's one thing to produce a movement in isolation, and it's completely different to produce a coordination of movements. You define with the instruction what style of coordination you want, and then you memorize these instructions, these intentions. Alexander used the term messages. It's not because you send a message that the message is going to arrive at destination. First, you have to create the path. And this is where the process of conscious guidance and control is necessary. Without it, it would be magic. It would be thinking that just because you're using the mind, well, the physical aspect is going to follow. Well, be my guest. It's not exactly like this. So Alexander makes a comment. He says that it is essential in the necessary re-education of the subject through conscious guidance and control that in every case, the means whereby, rather than the end, should be held in mind. As long as the end is held in mind, instead of the means, the series of acts will always be performed in accordance with the mode established by old habits. And the mode established with old habits is associated with the sensory guidance, the sensory appreciation that all the past experience have, in fact, created for the pupil. So the series of acts are the means whereby the gesture is constructed. If you do not stop and start to use the conscious reasoning mind and the conscious controlling mind to make sure that the movement you intend, the messages you send are really produced in practice, you're not, in fact, re-educating yourself through conscious guidance and control. It's as simple as that. And the thing is, it's quite strange that all this is written in the books. This is written in the first book. You will find that in the second book it's the same. It's not something that appeared at the end of Alexander's career. It's from the start. So I find it curious that Alexander would teach with his hands. It seems the only way nowadays. But in fact, considering that when you are touched by someone, even with extreme skill, in fact, you cannot reason the movements that the person has coordinated in order to obtain a certain use. So it's quite contradictory. I have given lessons to many Alexander teachers that have been teaching for many years, and they suddenly discovered what conscious guidance and control could mean. They had no idea that they could direct, well, first, represent movements, represent a series of acts that are the necessary basis for a gesture. They discovered also that they could use rules that when one part was moving, we could want another part to move in the opposite direction. So for example, we have a rule for the elbow. When the elbow is directed, so you will find that Alexander has plenty of instructions relating to the elbow. And he says that these movements should include a coordinated organization of the torso. Yet is never put to in writing the new orders. I have not any problem with that. I can understand that he wanted to keep his technique private. I think he wanted to attract people to have lessons with him instead of explaining how the technique should be practiced by a person that has no teacher. It was very important for him to do. It was a marketing act, in fact. It's very different. My position, I am not into marketing at all. I am there to try and explain how this works, how the conscious guidance and control scheme of reeducation can work for the pupil, where the idea is not to bring the teacher to a hero posture of being an extraordinary kind of person that can really impart some fantastic experience to someone. No, I'm not interested. I'm interested in having the pupil understand better and better what is the technique about. So Alexander certainly wanted to attract pupils, and because of it, he never defined the new orders. The only orders that we've been transmitted are the order of inhibition, the preventive orders, neck free, head forward and up, back to lengthen and widen, which are never to be done. And so this is a new way of understanding how we can use new orders in order to, in fact, plan a series of acts that are different from the series of acts that come to us without any effort, without any conscious effort, because we've always moved the different parts of the torso in relation to the arm with the same series. As soon as you want to change one of the movements of the series, considering the whole series on video, then you start to enter into the realm of reeducation. Because then you will find that, well, the pupil has to apply his reasoning mind to the problem. It's not anymore a physical procedure to reach forward with the hand. It's not anymore physical. You enter the psychophysical, where the psycho and the physical are absolutely not equal. It's not 50-50, 50 physical and 50 mental. No, it's more 80-20 or 85-90-10. You will, and the 90 is for the mental. It's the representation, first of all. It's the memory of the intentions. When you start to have 4 or 5 or 6 intentions of movement, there is a real problem of memory that comes in. That never occur in somatic treatment, because when the teacher is touching the pupil, well, the pupil is still rehearsing his old series of preventing orders, and so you don't need any memory for that. Once you're on the let the neck be free, to let the head go forward and up, to let the back lengthen and widen, to let the knees go forward and away. Let's for example take that one. It's a mantra. You don't need any skill. Well, imagine a different perspective where when you're going to reach forward with the hand, you want a certain movement, a certain trajectory for the index, for the thumb, for the little finger, for the elbow, relatively to a movement of the ribs. And depending on where the ribs are, you can have the lower ribs going in one direction and the upper ribs going into another direction. You will understand that this is completely different, especially when you consider that sometimes it's necessary to change the orders. I mean, change the way order 1 is positioned relatively to order 2, order 3, order 4, order 5, order 6. And I give orders to my pupils all the time I give new orders of movements that have to be completely separated from the idea of the preventing orders. For example, let the back to lengthen and widen is a preventing order. Why is it a preventing order? It's a preventing order because if the pupil does not reason out that lengthening and widening the back, in fact, involve a series of acts. And the series of acts is quite large when you think of lengthening and widening the back. Well, what will happen is that the pupil will just give the order and trust to his sensory appreciation to hope that the back is going to lengthen and widen. And of course, on video, it will never happen. It will be seen that after years and years of somatic training, years and years of lying down on the table, as soon as the person makes a movement with one part of the torso, let's say leaning, so the lower part of the torso has to change relationship with the hands. As soon as this happens, on video, the back is shortening. It's unmissable. Once you start observing, it's unmissable. It's not a big deal. It's not a great problem. It's just a question that the person has to start use the reasoning mind and start to observe that, yes, there are different moving parts in the torso. And depending on the series of movement you apply to them, of course, you're going to get a different result. So lengthening the back, widening the back, these two different actions are made of a series of acts. And the purpose of the conscious guidance control system is to, well, start to consider these acts. Again, I need to turn to Alexander. I'm going to work with this sentence. Alexander says, when each stage of the series essential to the means whereby is correctly apprehended by the conscious mind of the subject, the old habit can be broken up, and every muscular action can be consciously directed until the new and correct guiding sensations have established the new proper habits, which in their turn become subconscious but a more highly evolved plane. This is a highly problematic sentence. So I want to stop a second and talk about it. I'm just realizing that I've gone way past the time. I've been talking too much once more, but let's consider this sentence. I think there just should be another hour in order to see how this can unfold. But for the moment, Alexander is talking of each stage of the series essential to the means whereby, which means that there are series essential to the means whereby. The means whereby are not inhibition and directions. They are series of acts. It's a series of acts comes very, very often in Alexander's sentences in his books. So to me, these are series of movements. And this series of movement can be observed. Why would Alexander need mirrors if it was to feel something? The mirrors are going to give you an objective evidence. It's much better use a video recording because the video recording helps you to differentiate from the guidance and the control. There is a great problem of feeling into a gesture or feeling into a readjustment. You're given 6 commands, 6 new orders of movements. You want the hand, the thumb, the little finger, and the elbow, and the ribs to, describe a gesture. And this, you are given 1-2 seconds in order to perform the readjustment. If you start to feel one instructions, one order, if you start to want to have a sensory guiding effect, well, it's too late. Any movement that lasts 1 second or 2 seconds is going to be too short for you to feel or to have a guiding sensation. There are no, I can't understand what Alexander means, because on one side he said to us, and look at the sentence, he said that the pupil has to correctly apprehend the series essential to the means whereby. But he adds, by the conscious mind. To apprehend the series essential doesn't mean to feel. The conscious mind does not feel. The conscious mind can describe, the conscious mind can measure, can evaluate, can relate things together, or separate things if you want, but the conscious mind doesn't feel anything. So what is Alexander talking about? What is that? What are these correct guiding sensations? To tell you the truth, I can't tell. This part does not make any sense to me. On one side, you cannot say that the series essential to the means whereby has to be correctly apprehended by the conscious mind, and especially when he says each stage. When you say each stage of the series essential to the means whereby, what it means is that there are different stages. So what do you mean by different stages? Are they different stages? My experience could be that there is one stage where you start to describe a few movements, a few trajectory of different parts that should happen in 2 seconds during the same gesture. And you try and perform according to these instructions. Then you watch on screen on the video recording with motion analysis. You decide whether you have correctly translated the instruction, the new orders of the series essential to the means whereby. And of course, first stage, you discover that not. You discover that you have maybe reasoned out correctly, but what appears on screen is not exactly what you wanted. Two things. One is that you will discover that unwanted movement has added themselves. There are other parts of the mechanism that are now reacting to what you're doing, and very often you don't want these new movements to happen. The correct instructions have been given, you've tried to do the correct orders, and suddenly the correct orders are more or less appearing the way you want them to appear, more or less. There are stages. So that explains the more or less. But you discover that some movements are totally unwanted, that have appeared somewhere else. Maybe in some parts that have nothing to do. For example, you're working with the elbows and the ribs, and suddenly you discover that the ankles are turning, and suddenly there is an unwanted pressure on the outside of the feet. Alexander points to that problem. So suddenly you discover that yes, you have the correct series, more or less, but there are new movements that are appearing. So you need to give yourself more instructions because you don't want these incorrect consequences to happen. So you will find that you need a new series of orders. So this is only one example of a stage of the series essential to the means whereby. So clearly apprehended by the conscious mind of the student, of the subject, means that this is a reasoning that is going on. This is in fact, checking what you see after you've projected the movement in the performance, and reasoning out what should be the next experiment. It has nothing to do with correct guiding sensations. Where is Alexander getting to imagine that first you have to consciously direct the new movements, and then you're going to get new and correct guiding sensations? Well, of course, when you perform the new series essential to the means whereby, you're going to feel something. You're going to see yourself, but you're also going to feel. It may well be that you feel light, that you feel, organized, that you feel much less in a situation of disequilibrium. does this constitute a guiding sensation? Does this really explain? Is Alexander explaining that then you can guide yourself with these sensations? I think this is in total opposition with the idea of stages, because once you've got the correct guiding sensations, I can tell you, stages are finished. You're there. You've got it. Satisfied. Yes? Well, it depends on the speed of your motion analysis system. Because if you suddenly slow down your recording, which is now very easy to do with modern equipment, you start to analyze movements a bit more finely. And when you analyze movement more finely, you're bound to find new problems. You're bound to find that the movement as you were performing them were not exactly performed. There are some movement that started before the others, some that ended after the 2 seconds. And so any guiding sensation that you had cannot be correct guiding sensations. So you have to understand that in his books, Alexander is very, very controversial. He's not using the same theory all the time. There is the conscious guidance theory that is more or less always there. And sometimes, like here, you have the old theory. The old theory that in order to perform movement, you have to feel them comes in. The somatic theory is still there. He's contradicting himself in his terms, but he's talking of a more evolved plane. So you establish new proper habits which become subconscious, but on a more highly evolved plane. Well, this is not interesting for us. It's like a stop in the experiments, a stop in the discovery. Can tell you before that happens, well, you can die twice. I mean, a lifetime. Often I get that question from my pupils: when will I get? You understand? On top of this, on top of this. Oh yes, when are you going to master all this? Is that the question? And the person say, yes, exactly. I want to know when I'm, for example, when will I be fit to teach? Is a question my students always ask. Most of the time, I get angry. I can't throw a book at them because I give long distance lessons. They're protected by the fact that I use a camera all the time. But I certainly could throw a book at them because in the way I teach with conscious guidance and control, you should start teaching straight away. Well, of course, the first person you need to teach is yourself. Alexander taught himself. It is the fundamental purpose of teaching the initial Alexander technique is to become a teacher of yourself. But as soon as you become a teacher of yourself, you can be a teacher of someone else. You can at least impart what you have understood of the process. You're not going to say that you're on top of the process, that you control your cable. No, you don't. This is a good example. No, but you're going to say that for the moment you have started to understand that there was more than meet the eyes in the coordination of movements. That the subject was really, really deep and wide. That we are talking of a plane of evolution, if you want, a plane of discovery, a plane of new experiments. Limit it? Why would you limit it? Why would you say that that's it? I'm there. I am the one. I'm certified. I have a diploma. No, you don't need any diploma to teach the initial Alexander technique or to teach the beginning of it, the beginning of the use, the free use and consciousness of the controlling reasoning mind or reasoning controlling mind. in the sentence. This is not finished. This is finished for today, but it is not finished. I will explain more about the series essential to the means whereby in the next episode. In the next episode, we are going to have a concrete application, because otherwise it stays on the fringe. It stays on the very intellectual approach, and many of our listeners want to have concrete things to work with, and I understand that. So next time we are going to start with an illustration in constructive conscious control, and we are going to see exactly what Alexander is saying about these series essential to the means whereby in practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeando. For people watching, we've done quite a lot of videos already on specifically on the orders and on memory, so you might want to check them out for it's related to some of the stuff Jeando's been talking about here. And so thank you a lot, Jeando, and we will see everyone in the next video. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.